Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of New England's Harold Alfond Forum. I'd like to begin by asking you to please turn off your cell phones, and also note that only approved photographers may use flash photography during this event. My name is Mike Sheldon. I'm the interim provost here at the University of New England. On behalf of the university, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th annual George and Barbara Bush Distinguished Lecture, truly one of the highlights of the academic year here at the University of New England. We have several UNE trustees and former trustees present this evening. I ask that they please rise at this time so that we may acknowledge them. Thank you all for being here. As many of you know, this lecture series is made possible through the generosity of Peter and Rosalind Whalen. Mr. and Mrs. Whalen, would you please rise so that we may also acknowledge you? It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. James D. Herbert, the University of New England's 6th president.
Thanks so much. So thank you, Provost Sheldon. It's my pleasure to welcome the students, members of our professional staff, faculty, and friends of the UNE community to the 8th annual George and Barbara Bush Distinguished Lecture. UNE is proud to offer this lecture as a way of celebrating the legacy of President George Herbert Walker Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush. And I'm humbled and honored as UNE's new president to play my own small role in the continuance of this annual rite of fall here at UNE. Although President and Mrs. Bush are not able to join us tonight, their presence is definitely felt here, and we wish them very, very well. Their presence is also felt each and every day on our campus here at UNE. Our George and Barbara Bush Center stands as a monument to the impact that these two iconic Americans have had on the state of Maine and on our nation more broadly. As my anticipation has grown for this event, I recently reread President Bush's inauguration address, which he delivered January 20th, 1989 to the American people and to the United States government, including Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. That's Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell of Maine, for anyone who is not familiar. In any case, as I was rereading President Bush's inaugural remarks, I was reminded about just how much our world has changed in the nearly 3 decades since he took office. I was reminded about how much more complex our challenges have become. On the day that he was sworn into the highest office, President Bush was unequivocal in the optimism that he expressed for the future of world affairs. And why shouldn't he be? Democracy was winning out or was in the process of winning out over communism. The Cold War was thawing. The Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. And as he took office in that distinct moment in history, President Bush envisioned a new era of peace and international cooperation. There are times, he said, when the future seems as thick as fog. You sit and wait, hoping the mists will lift and reveal the right path. But this is a time when the future seems a door you can just walk right through into a room called tomorrow. How could he have seen the profound challenges of our present time, the destabilizing effects of terrorism, climate change, globalization, automation, rising nationalism? On the home front, President Bush was considerably less sanguine. Long before the advent of the 24-hour news cycle or the presidential tweet, he described a festering atmosphere of divisiveness in Washington and, by extension, throughout American communities. We need to compromise, he said, and I'll quote from his remarks. We've had dissension, we need harmony, we've had a chorus of discordant voices. For Congress, too, has changed in our time. There's grown a certain divisiveness. We've seen the hard looks and heard the statements in which not each other's ideas are challenged, but each other's motives. And our great parties have too often been far apart and untrusting of each other. To my friends, and yes, I do mean friends, in the loyal opposition, and yes, I mean loyal, I put out my hand. I'm putting out my hand to you, Mr. Speaker. I'm putting out my hand to you, Mr. Majority Leader. And when our fathers were young, Mr. Speaker, our differences ended at the water's edge. And we don't wish to turn back time, but when our mothers were young, Mr. Majority Leader, the Congress and the executive were capable of working together. Let us negotiate soon and hard, but in the end, let us produce the American people await action. They didn't send us here to bicker. They asked us to rise above the merely partisan. In crucial things, unity, and this, my friends, is crucial. So what an important message that still resonates today as our nation faces so many challenges, both domestically and overseas. Our political leaders need to compromise. They need to work together, just as we all do in our daily lives. They need to give each other a fair hearing. If they don't, there can be no opportunity for collaboration, no opportunity for compromise. There can only be entrenchment to points behind ideological lines. I don't know exactly which challenges our distinguished guest, Senator Mitchell, will speak about tonight, but I do know that very few people are as qualified as he to shed light on the important topic of his lecture tonight, challenges facing the U.S. at home and abroad. Throughout his long career, Senator Mitchell has earned a reputation as the consummate negotiator. He's relied on his ability to find common ground when he was an elected official, just as he did in his role before that as a federal judge. Later, when President Clinton needed someone to take on what many considered to be an impossible task, brokering peace in Northern Ireland, he chose Senator Mitchell. And Senator Mitchell succeeded, negotiating an agreement that brought an end to generations of violence. When President Obama sought to play a productive role in the ongoing Arab-Israeli peace process, he appointed Senator Mitchell as his special envoy for Middle East peace. And when Major League Baseball wanted to investigate its steroid problem, it was Senator Mitchell who stepped in between the feuding owners and players and conducted an impartial review of the extent to which performance-enhancing enhancers had permeated the game. Senator Mitchell's greatest strength has always been seeing both sides of an issue and looking for common ground. He looked for common ground from which dissenting parties might build bridges that, after intricate construction, meet over troubled waters at a place of peace. In 1989, he was awarded the National Constitution Center's Liberty Medal for his work in the Northern Ireland peace process. In 1999, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2008, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He's the author of 5 books, including a memoir entitled The Negotiator, Reflections on an American Life, and A Path to Peace, which was published just last year. This past May, Senator Mitchell visited UNE's campus in Tangier, Morocco, speaking at the Tangier Global Forum. He shared his wisdom with an international audience of students and community members, and tonight we're honored to host him here in Biddeford. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Senator Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Herbert, for that overly generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm reception. For me, it is a real pleasure to be here for many reasons. First, I've had the privilege of being on this campus before, going way back many years. And as all of you here know, University of New England has been, over the past couple of decades, a truly remarkable story of growth and success to which many, many people have contributed a lot here. And Dr. Herbert, I join everyone here in welcoming you to the University of New England and to Maine. We look forward to a continuation of the growth and importance of this university to this community. I have been in Biddeford, Saco, and Saco many, many times in the past. It's always a pleasure to come here to meet old friends and hopefully to make new ones. I had the pleasure earlier in the reception of meeting with some of the young scholars who are here on scholarships by a program I created when I left the Senate. We now give out a scholarship to a graduate from every high school in Maine every year. We have now given out more than 2,700 of them, with about $15 million in direct assistance. And it is by far the most meaningful thing I feel I've done in my life. And if there are any of our scholars here, I know they were all at the earlier reception, I'd ask them to stand as representative of all of the young people of Maine, who I think are outstanding people for our future. Now, I do speak often, so often that for me the highlight of any program is the introduction. I'm very grateful to you, Dr. Herbert, for living up to a strong tradition of very generous introductions. It's obviously always pleasant to hear good things said about yourself, particularly in front of a group mostly of strangers, but the risk is that if you hear that stuff often enough, you may begin to believe some of it. And so I like to begin with a story about introductions and an occasion on which I was brought back down to earth. I spent 5 years working on the peace process in Northern Ireland. And when it was completed and we'd reached an agreement, I came back to Maine. I have a home on Mount Desert Island, and I wrote a book about that experience. When it was published, I traveled all around the country speaking and promoting the book, and in the process of developing the tour, I received many invitations, and I learned the interesting fact that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them invited me to come. I couldn't go to all, but I did go to many, and as I traveled the country speaking to these Irish American groups, they developed among them an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantastic, sometimes truly ridiculous introductions of me. The proper reaction for me, of course, would have been to show some humility, to ask them to keep it short, but I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left something out. And as a result, I became overly impressed with myself. So much so that when we got to the last stop on the book tour, it was in Stamford, Connecticut, the Irish American Club there, I had a hard time squeezing my head through the front door. When I got inside, the first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed up to me, very nervous and excited, shook my hand vigorously, spent several minutes praising me, and then she said, "I don't live anywhere near here. I drove 3 hours across the whole state of Connecticut just to ask you, please, would you autograph my poster?" She handed me a poster with a big photograph on it and a pen. I looked at it, I said, "I'd be very happy to sign your poster, but before I do, I think there's something I should tell you." She said, "What is it?" I said, "I'm not Henry Kissinger." It was a big picture of Kissinger. She said, "You're not? Well, who are you anyway?" And when I told her, she said, "Why, that's just terrible." She said, "I drove 3 hours to meet a great man like Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish I could do something." And she thought for a moment. She said, "Well, there is." And when I asked her what it was, she leaned forward, I leaned forward. We were kind of in a conspiratorial crouch. And she said in a loud whisper, "Nobody will ever know the difference." She said, "Would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster?" So I did. And ever since then, I've learned to enjoy these kind words by guys like Dr. Herbert, but don't take them too seriously. You know, I also think about that. I'm often asked in audiences like this and by reporters, do I miss the Senate? My answer is, like most things in life, I miss some of it, and other things I don't miss. One of the things I do really miss is traveling around the state of Maine, meeting and talking to people. I was born and raised in Waterville, but I was surprised, although I shouldn't have been when I entered the Senate, to realize that I had not been to most of the towns in Maine. You think about your own life. You live in a certain place, you establish certain patterns, but you don't go to every town in the state. And over the course of my time in the Senate, I did go to every town. I spoke at the graduation of every high school in Maine, and it really was, for me, a remarkable and eye-opening education, and there was a lot of humility acquired along the way. I was reminded of it recently when I spoke in Brooksville, Maine. It's up not far from Blue Hill, and they had an event there, quite large, about the size of this crowd, and it was held in a barn at a working farm. It's called Dave's Follies Farm in Brooksville. And outside, they have a sign that advertises the products for sale each day. And as I came in, I knew beforehand there's a lot of wisdom in small towns in Maine. A farmer said to me, pointed to the sign, and he said, "That's what's for sale here today." And the sign had lamb, pork, manure. And he said, "We're not in much doubt about what you're going to sell here today, Senator Tours." And that reminded me, when I first entered the Senate and was not well known, I made it a point to go around, travel around as much as I could, to meet as many people as I could. And I was traveling in a rural area not far from Waterville, the town of Sydney, where there were several dairy farms. And I was going door to door, dairy farm to dairy farm each day. And on the first morning, I stopped at a dairy farm, and the farmer was very kind and invited me in to have a cup of coffee with him and his wife. He asked me if I would take a picture with him and his wife, and of course I said yes. And then he said, "Would you mind having a picture taken with my 2 cows?" Well, I'd never been asked to have a picture taken with a cow before, but I said, "Well, sure, of course." So we went out back, and he had a photographer from the local paper, and I had my picture taken with 2 cows. Well, it turned out that these were very important cows. The government of Saudi Arabia was then in the process of trying to upgrade its dairy production. And they hired an agricultural expert to travel around America and find the best cows they could, and they bought them. And 2 of them were from this farm in Sydney. The farmer was quite rightly proud of it. So the next day in the Waterville paper, my picture appeared on the front page with the 2 cows, and the story explaining that the cows were going to Saudi Arabia, and I was here to see them off. So the next day, I'm continuing in the same area, and I went to one farm, and it was a very long road from the highway down to where the farm was. And so when I got there, you do this enough and you kind of get a sense of people's reaction to you. An elderly man opened the door and I could tell right away there was kind of an edge of hostility. So trying to make small talk, I said to him, I said, boy, you got a really long driveway from the road down here. And he said, well, he said, if it was any shorter, it wouldn't reach my house. So I said, I put out my hand, I introduced myself. He said, I know who you are. I said, how do you know that? He said, I seen your picture in the paper this morning with them 2 cows. I said, what'd you think about it? He said, Senator, I'm a Republican. I think we should keep the cows here and send you to Saudi Arabia. So anyway, I kind of miss that kind of stuff. But it is really nice to be here. Let me say at the outset, it is a great honor for me personally to participate in a distinguished lecture series in honor of President George H.W. and his wife, Barbara Bush. I'm grateful to them. I'm grateful to the university for inviting me to participate, to Peter and Lindy Whalen for their support of this lecture series. And I should put in a word for a fellow Waterville native, Harold Alfond, who helped build this beautiful building as he's done for buildings all over Maine. I grew up in Waterville. Harold was originally from Massachusetts, but he married a Waterville girl, spent most of his life there, and I knew him for my entire life. He was a truly great philanthropist, and his family continues that tradition today, helping to mostly construct facilities in colleges and other institutions of higher learning. So, Harold, if you're up there looking down, we're all grateful to you. I had the privilege of serving as Senate Majority Leader during President Bush's tenure. And so I observed firsthand the high and admirable qualities that President and Mrs. Bush brought to the presidency and to the White House. Through his long and distinguished career, President George H.W. Bush served the people of our country with intelligence, with dignity, and with distinction. Inevitably, in our competitive political process, there were differences on some issues, but there were many important issues on which those differences were bridged in the national interest. These included major budget compromises that reduced the deficit and encouraged economic growth, as well as unique legislative efforts like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provided for the first time the opportunity for those of our fellow citizens who suffer from disabilities to live full and independent lives. Another major issue we dealt with was the protection of our environment. The Clean Air Act of 1990 was of long-lasting national significance because of its importance to Maine and because it so clearly demonstrated President Bush's leadership. I want to discuss it and the broader subject of environmental protection in some detail. The early American settlers spread across a continent that seemed limitless to them. But the steady increase in population, rapid industrialization, the movement of people from farms to cities, and the invention of the motor vehicle irrevocably changed the lives of most Americans. By the time Ed Muskie entered the Senate, 85% of our nation's waterways were heavily polluted, unfit for fishing, swimming, drinking water, or recreation. And the air in most of our major urban areas was heavily polluted. Senator Muskie was the principal author of the 2 landmark laws that helped clean our water and our land. And so today, the numbers are reversed. 85% of our nation's waterways are clean. And you can see it in every major river in Maine. And the level of air pollution has been substantially reduced, despite large increases in the numbers of people and of motor vehicles. The effort to deal with air pollution began with the emergence of clear and convincing evidence of its adverse effect on the health of millions of Americans. It was not then any longer an issue of trees. It was an issue of the health of our citizens. That led to the passage of the Clean Air Act of 1970, which was primarily directed at automobile emissions. That act was amended in 1977 to extend some deadlines for compliance, and in some other ways it was improved. And I was appointed to the Senate to replace Senator Muskie just 3 years after the adoption of those amendments. Even by then, it was already clear that further changes were needed to meet new and larger challenges from pollution. For the next 10 years, I was among a small group of senators from both parties who worked to bring the issue to the attention of the public and to try to get legislation enacted. Through a series of public hearings and statements, we made some progress in publicizing the problem, but we were completely unsuccessful in moving the legislation forward. There were many obstacles, and foremost among them were the fact that the President and the Senate Majority Leader were opposed to our efforts. President Reagan was opposed to the Clean Air Law on regulatory grounds. Senator Byrd didn't share that view on regulatory grounds, but he was very protective of the interests of his constituents, the coal miners of West Virginia. And of course, clean air legislation was seen as a threat to their jobs. In addition to the growing knowledge of damage to human health, over the decade of the 1980s, evidence had accumulated that emissions from coal-fired utility plants were being deposited in the lakes and streams of the northeastern states, including Maine, and the provinces of eastern Canada. The Canadian government, alarmed by the sharp increase in the acidification of its waters, urged a reduction in emissions. But the possibility of action remained remote. Then came the election of 1988. Within a month of his inauguration, the newly elected President, George H.W. Bush, reversed the policy of his predecessor and announced that he favored and himself would propose legislation for a new, more effective Clean Air Act, including action on acid rain. President Bush's courageous decision made action on clean air legislation possible. Suddenly, dramatically, the question shifted from will there be a clean air bill to what will be in the Clean Air Bill. All who were concerned about air pollution were impressed and heartened by the President's statement. There followed a long and very difficult negotiating and legislative process. But by late October of 1990, the House and Senate approved a Clean Air Bill by overwhelming votes, 401 to 25 in the House, 89 to 10 in the Senate. 22 years later, the Environmental Protection Agency reported that since 1990, nationwide, air quality had improved significantly. In 2011, the Natural Resources Defense Council concluded, quote, The Clean Air Act is a genuine American success story and one of the most effective tools in U.S. history for protecting public health. Among other such benefits, they estimated that the 19 legislation saved nearly 2 million American lives. It was a bipartisan effort, a long and hard struggle, but it was worth it. And it would not have happened but for President Bush's courageous leadership. I'd now like to discuss the current major challenge to our environment. Since it came into existence, the Earth has gone through phases of warming and cooling, the result of natural forces like volcanic eruptions and variations in the amounts of naturally occurring greenhouse gases. But the warming of the past century has been more rapid than ever. According to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the influence of natural causes is too small to account for the warming of the past few decades. What does explain it is the dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions from human-related activity. The burning of coal, oil, and gas for transportation, heat, cooling, and electricity is the primary source of human-generated emissions. Although oceans and forests absorb gases from the atmosphere, they have been unable to keep up with the rising level of emissions. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated, and I quote, "Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented. The atmosphere and the oceans have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, and the sea level has risen." 2016 was the hottest year on record. The previous record year was 2015, and the previous record before that was 2014. What I've just said is not theory or speculation. It is a considered conclusion, reached and reinforced by scientific inquiry and research, all widely published, and accepted by the overwhelming majority of scientists in the world today. Among the adverse results already occurring are increases in air pollution in many parts of the world, droughts, more intense storms and floods, all of which can and do cause sickness and can lead to premature death. The World Health Organization has estimated that, and I quote, "Climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths each year between 2030 and 2050. There is, of course, room for legitimate, even necessary debate on how to respond to this crisis. Because the Earth is warming does not mean that every suggestion to deal with it makes sense. We should now be engaged in a debate in the U.S. and around the world that tries to assess the benefits and costs of the many suggestions that have been made to deal with climate change. But that debate is not occurring because some in our country insist that there is no such thing as global warming and oppose any effort to deal with it. These deniers of science include, sadly, the President of the United States, the Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and many leading members of Congress. Many of them hold to the view expressed by the President that global warming is a hoax perpetrated by China to harm the U.S. economy. This denial of science is not just wrong, it's dangerous to the people of this country and to those of the world. One of the difficulties in organizing an effective response to a crisis like this is that it seems so distant, so theoretical, so huge, that any action taken by one individual cannot be seen as of consequence on a global scale. But to the people of Maine, this is not a distant threat. It is as real and as close as the ocean, which is just a few hundred yards from where we are today. The Gulf of Maine, the huge body of water that is so close by, may fairly be described as an area of ground zero in global warming. In 2015, the Portland Press-Herald published a series of reports on the Gulf of Maine, and those reports began with this dramatic statement. Since 2004, the Gulf of Maine has warmed faster than any place else on the planet, except for an area northeast of Japan. And during the Northwest Atlantic Ocean heat wave of 2012, average water temperatures hit the highest levels in the 150 years that humans have been recording them. The effects are not fully predictable, but a reasonable interpretation of recent events raises deep concerns. The changes that are resulting include the loss of entire fish stocks and the movement of other fish stocks to colder waters, in particular the lobster population. Meanwhile, invasive warm water species are moving into the warming waters of the southern part of the Gulf. Now, time constraints here permit me just to touch the surface of this challenge, but I urge every one of you to pull up and read the Press Herald series. In addition, the Gulf of Maine Research Center and the Bigelow Laboratory have published many articles about the observed effects on the Gulf of Maine. This is not distant in time and place. It is here and now. How our country responds to this challenge will have effects all over the world. And I want to conclude my remarks by saying that I have confidence in America and in Americans. I believe that science and reason will prevail over fear and looking backward. I believe that we must, we can, and we will devise the policies needed to deal effectively with these and the many other challenges that we will confront in the coming decades, just as President Bush did when he faced up to the environmental challenge of his time. We're fortunate to be Americans, citizens of a country which, despite our many and serious imperfections, to me is still the most open, the most free, the most just society in all of human history. America is freedom and opportunity. That has made it possible for most of us here today to lead lives of relative ease, largely insulated from the harsh winds of life that so many of our fellow citizens confront by our families, our education, our resources, and the webs of friendship and influence that each of us has woven over a lifetime. It is in our interest and theirs to make these opportunities available to all Americans. To do so, we have to remain true to our principles. Our democratic ideals distinguished our country from the very beginning, and they have always appealed to people all over the world. Our economic strength and military power are, of course, necessary, but our ideals are and have been the primary basis of American influence in the world. They're not easily summarized, but surely they include the sovereignty of the people, the primacy of individual liberty, our highest value, an independent judicial system, the rule of law applied equally to every citizen and, crucially, to the government itself, and opportunity for every member of our society. No one of us here, no American should ever forget that the United States was a great nation long before it was a great economic or military power. The United States was a great nation when the Declaration of Independence was issued and the Constitution was adopted, because they set forth the ideals that have made our country great. We recognize that all human beings and all human institutions are imperfect. We acknowledge that we are not always right, and we can never be perfectly consistent. But we can and we must work harder and better to live up to our principles as individuals and as Americans. And finally, we must especially work to more fully realize the aspiration of equal opportunity for all of our citizens. In our society, no one should be guaranteed success, but everyone should have a fair chance to succeed. From the experience of our daily lives, we know that equal opportunity remains an aspiration. We must try to make it a reality. We must lift our actions to the level of our aspirations. Every child in our society should have the care, the early development, and the full education to enable them to rise as high and as far as their talent and their willingness to work will take them. Our goal should be a society which encourages striving, celebrates success, is conducive to innovation, and enables us to benefit from the talent, the energy, and the skill of every single American. That's our challenge, and we must make it our destiny. Thank you all very much for having me here today. Cut it off.
So the senator is welcome. He's open for questions, so please. I'll let you pick up.
Now, let me tell one more story about questions. The last time I ran for statewide office, I was sitting in my office in Portland doing some press interviews when I got a telephone call from a principal at a high school way up in northern Maine. He said, we're having an assembly tomorrow, 1,200 students. You know, we have consolidated schools, so although they're in rural areas, they cover a large area, so they have a lot of students. He said, and we'd like you to come and speak to an assembly of our students tomorrow. I figured they must have had a cancellation. So I said, well, okay, I'll come. So I drove about 3.5 hours up to 4 hours up to northern Maine, and I got there, and the students were all in the bleachers in the gym, 1,200 of them, and in the middle of the gym there were 2 chairs and a microphone. The principal came in and introduced me. Now, I'd spoken at every high school in Maine at least once, and I knew that the attention span of high school students to me and my remarks never reached 1 minute. So I didn't give any talks. I just got up and I said, I'll be glad to take your questions. And as I used to say then, and if anybody would like to make a speech, I'll be glad to hear it. Sure enough, a kid gets up in the bleachers. He says, Senator, I do have a speech I'd like to give. And he crosses the gym. He has a big stack of papers under his arm, so I knew trouble was coming. He propped the papers up and he began reading a speech. After about 10 minutes, I sat down next to the principal. He was very angry. He leaned over, he said, "Senator, we called this assembly so the students could hear you." He said, "We can hear that kid every day." And in fact, we do. He said, "You're a person of authority. Go up there and take the microphone away from that kid." I looked at the kid. I'd never seen him before, but the election is 2 weeks away. And I thought, this kid very well could have many relatives of voting age. So I said to the principal, "In this building, you're a person of authority. You go up there and take the microphone away from him." He wouldn't do it, so the kid spoke for the full hour. When he finished, the bell rang, the 1,200 students poured out of the gym, and I drove back 3.5 hours, having said nothing. From that moment, I stopped inviting speeches. But now, I'm not running for anything. So if you want to ask a question, ask a question. If you feel like making a speech, be my guest. I'll be glad to take the comments here. If anybody's got a question.
If you would like to ask a question of Senator Mitchell, please come to a microphone on either side of the audience here. State your name, and then please deliver your question.
It's pretty tough, but here comes one now.
And I will note that there will be a limited amount of time for questions, so if you're standing in line and you don't get to ask your question, please don't be offended.
It doesn't look like that's going to be part of the problem. Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Tom Flynn, and you mentioned that under President Bush, the end of the Cold War, as we've known it. Today, what is your assessment of our relationship with Russia, and what would you recommend going forward?
The United States is the dominant world power and will be for as far into the future as human beings can see. We have relations with almost every country in the world, about 194 of them, and it is, I believe, the desire of the overwhelming majority of Americans to have good relations with every country. That's not possible because many of them disagree among themselves and obviously seek to have us adopt positions supportive of their country's position. And we have had, over the previous three-quarters of the century, a long-standing conflict with the then Soviet Union and now Russia. That ended late in the last century with the triumph of democracy and the failure of communism. I believe that most Americans would like good relations with Russia, but I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that the current difficulties arise from the fact that the government of Russia, at the direction of President Putin, violated international law in its actions in the Crimea and Ukraine, for which sanctions were imposed by the United Nations, supported by the United States and most of the countries in the world, and certainly the countries of Europe, in particular the countries of what is described as Eastern Europe, which lived for a half-century under communist domination and want very much to have their own independence and be free of that domination. So I think we should be firm but not belligerent in our response. I think we also ought not to overstate the nature of the challenge. Some of you are old enough here to remember in the 1984 campaign for re-election, one of President Reagan's most effective television ads was one that showed a big bear lumbering through the forest coming to get us. The threat was the Soviet Union was about to overtake us. In fact, at that very moment, it was in the terminal stages of a vast decline, inevitable given the nature of communism itself. And in 5 years, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So let's not overstate the problem now. The United States has an economy that is approaching $20 trillion, is by far the largest in the world. Russia's economy is not even in the top 10. It's smaller than Canada's, smaller than South Korea's. It's half the size of California's. And its economy is contracting under the weight of their own internal problems and of the sanctions that are being effected. While our economy has grown slower than we would like, our economy is so much larger. What keeps Russia important in international affairs is the possession of a massive nuclear arsenal, a holdover from the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and a government willing to deploy the threat of that and its formidable military force with respect to its neighbors. But when President Putin took office for the first time, he said his greatest fear was that for the first time in 300 years, Russia faced the prospect of sliding into the second or third echelon of nations. And of course, he was right, and it is a huge national humiliation for the Russian people to have gone from one of the two world superpowers now to a declining nation, both in population, in the size of its economy, and in influence around the world. And we have to recognize that and make a distinction in our policy and in our minds between the people of Russia and the government of Russia. And so I think we should be firm and fair. I believe that the sanctions that were imposed were appropriate, and until the government of Russia refrains from the kinds of actions that it took in the Crimea and the Ukraine, the first time violating national borders in Europe since the Second World War, that the sanctions should remain, but we should be open to good relations with them, providing they act in a manner consistent with the principles that we believe in and that I believe most nations in the world do believe in. I'm sorry, I'll come over here. Let me take it.
Senator Mitchell, I want to take you back to the Middle East, if I may. 50 years ago, President Nixon and your dear friend Henry Kissinger thought they had a deal done. And Jimmy Carter thought he had a deal done. My question to you is, what is bothering the Middle East peace process right now? What needs to be done? Does Israel have to stop building their kaputs or whatever they're doing out there? What needs to be done to get us back on the track? And if I may do a follow-up, sir, after your question, answer.
The Middle East is a large and complex subject, and I'll try hard to keep it relatively brief, but in so doing, I will, of necessity, oversimplify and not deal with every issue. First, I think it is critically important to understand that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict does not exist in a vacuum. It is greatly influenced by the region in which it is located, and in turn influences the region. Now, there have been successes in the past. President Carter was able to get a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. President Clinton was able to achieve a peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. They are imperfect, but they are huge pillars of stability in a region of extreme volatility at this time. It took 1,800 years following the birth of Christ for the world's population to reach 1 billion. The most recent billion, the seventh, was added in 13 years. And while the rate of increase has slowed somewhat, the most recent UN population projections are that the world's population will reach about 10 billion by mid-century. Of the 7.5 billion people in the world today, 1 in 5 is Muslim, about 1.5 billion. When the population reaches 10 billion, 1 in 3 will be Muslim, 3.5 billion. To put that into perspective, that was the total population of the world as recently as 1970. As we know, Islam is torn by internal conflict. So many of them go back to the founding, including the major internal division is between Sunni and Shia, and that goes back to the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. The dispute for control of the caliphate that he had built was not religious. It was a political struggle for power between two factions. The faction that prevailed became the Sunni. The faction that lost became the Shia. And for 1,400 years, they have been in conflict, sometimes flaring up intensely, as now, sometimes in remission. That continues to be a major part of the conflict today, as you have Shia-dominated Iran and Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia, reflecting the two opposite poles of that conflict. Internal to each side, there are further conflicts and divisions, and there is upheaval. And population continues to rise very dramatically. 92% of the population growth between now and mid-century will be in areas of turbulence, Middle East, parts of Asia, and Africa. The single most important factor in population growth is the status of women. Where women are independent and fully empowered, population rates stabilize. Where they are not, population rates rise. And as we know, there is turbulence in that region. Now, specifically to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I served 2 tours of duty there, one under Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, one under President Obama. I believe that the best interests of both Israelis and Palestinians will be served by an agreement between them. Just as today Israel highly values its treaties with Egypt and Jordan, because they do provide some degree of stability in a volatile region, so too would be the case in an agreement with the Palestinians. Now, I just wrote a book about that, and I won't try to recite the whole book. I'll just state one conclusion. Having spent much time there with the leaders, one of the problems is political and personal. There is deep hostility and mistrust. Neither side believes the other, and it's epitomized by the two leaders. Prime Minister Netanyahu believes that President Abbas does not have the personal political strength to reach an agreement and carry it through, and therefore he, Netanyahu, is unwilling to take the risks that will incur hostility among that sizable segment of his population which is opposed to there ever being a Palestinian state on the West Bank. President Abbas believes that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not serious, that he doesn't really favor a two-state solution, and he cites the fact that Netanyahu has been against, for, and against 5 times in the last several years, and now says he's for it, but not now. And so Abbas is unwilling to take the risk that will come because his society is divided. About half who support his policy of peaceful non-negotiation and a recognition of Israel, that's Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, and the half, Hamas, who insist on the use of violence to gain what they regard as their national identity. So it's very difficult. And we, of course, have strong support for Israel. We have an unshakable commitment to Israel's security. We also favor the creation of a Palestinian state. One other thing you should all look up on your computers. In January of 2000, just before leaving office, President George W. Bush traveled to Jerusalem. He assembled the Israeli and Palestinian leadership, and he made a powerful speech to them describing American policy. And in it, he said that they each should be vested in the other's success because they can't get what they want by denying to the other its success. He said to the Palestinians, you want a state? You ought to have one. We, the United States, favors a Palestinian state, but you can't get it until Israel has reasonable and sustainable security for its people. And he said to the Israelis, you want reasonable and sustainable security for people, you can't get it until Palestinians should get a state. You both should be vested in each other's interests. I believe President Bush was exactly right when he said that, and I believe that will soon, I hope, come to be realized by the leaders of both Israel and the Palestinian people, that the only way they can get what they want is to accommodate the other's concern.
Thank you, Senator. My follow-up question is on the domestic side. It's America. Okay, well, it's America. What do you think is bothering this country? What do you think is bothering this country? We're very divisive. This country.
You're going to be in line for a long time, I think. Well, look, I'm optimistic. I have to be frank. I had kids late in life. I have 2 teenagers. One's a college student, one's a high school student. I keep telling them they're going to live in a much better country, in a better world than the one I grew up in, and I believe that. I believe that we remain, as I said in my remarks, the most open, just, and free society in history. Yes, of course we have problems. So does every society. And there never was a time when there weren't problems in our country. Among the other reading I got for you, go look up the campaign for president in 1800. The candidates were Jefferson and Adams, 2 national icons, and what they said about each other is much worse than what anybody says today. The difference was, of course, they were only printed, a few copies, not many people read them. You didn't have cable news repeating everything and breaking news and sensationalism all the time. But this is a very large, diverse, strong country with a fundamental and basic sense of fairness and principle. And yet we have made terribly tragic mistakes in our history, over and over and over again. But the greatness of America has been a willingness to confront error and to take action to right the wrongs of the past. Sometimes too little, sometimes too late. And it is also, I might say, due in part to the fact that we are a diverse nation, which we benefit from our diversity. It is a source of strength, not weakness. 7 Americans received a Nobel Prize last year. 6 of them were immigrants. 6 of them. Right. Among the most successful business enterprises in the world, in history, are Apple, Amazon, and Google. Apple was created by Steve Jobs, whose father was born in Syria. Amazon was created by Jeff Bezos, whose adoptive father was born in Cuba. Google was created by Sergey Brin, a co-founder who himself was born in Russia. I ask you 2 rhetorical questions. Think about them as you drive home. Would we be a better country if they had not been admitted? And the second question, what do you think the chances are that if Steve Jobs had lived his life in Syria, he would have created Apple? Or Jeff Bezos in Cuba and Amazon? Or Sergey Brin in Russia? Genius knows no language, no race, no religion. It can be found wherever there are human beings. But it flourishes where there is freedom and opportunity and innovation and diversity, and that place is America. So yes, I'm very confident about our future.
If I could interject, please, before the next question is asked, this will be our last question. This is the time constraint we have. I'm sorry for those who didn't get their opportunity.
Sorry. I apologize because the problem has not been the questions, it's been the length of the answers, but they're hard to answer in yes, a few words. But go ahead. I'll try with you.
It's not going to be very good. Sorry about that. Amy Davidoff, I'm faculty here at the University of New England. And my name is Amy Davidoff. I am faculty of the University of New England. And my claim to fame is I'm a friend of your niece's, Mary, who is here tonight. So that's all I just know. I was going to not talk about world domination or Middle East peace. I was going to talk about, is there any way we can conscript you to find peace within our legislators? And the little speech I was going to just, our legislative budget, but my view is simply that until we get campaign finance reform under control, or campaign financing under control, I think the partisanship is just going to be a divide. I was wondering if you could talk about that for a minute.
On the day that I was elected Majority Leader of the Senate by the Senate Democrats, who were then, as the title suggests, in the majority, the first person I called was Bob Dole, who was the Republican leader. And I asked if I could come see him. He agreed. I went to his office. And I said to him, you've been here 28 years, I think it was. I've only been here a couple of years. You know more about the Senate than I'll ever know. But I've been here long enough to know that if the two leaders don't trust each other, the Senate is impossible to run. And so I said, I've come here to tell you how I intend to behave toward you and ask you to behave that way toward me. And I set forth the most basic, simple, fundamental standards of fairness, openness, loyalty, and honesty. He was delighted. We shook hands. To this moment, not once ever has a harsh word passed between Bob Dole and me, in public or in private. We became and we remain very close personal friends, despite the fact that for 6 years we disagreed just about every day on just about every bill. But we negotiated, we tried to resolve our differences, and when we couldn't, we put them to a vote in the Senate. Sometimes his view prevailed, sometimes mine prevailed, but we didn't make it personal. It's a tradition in the Senate on important bills that the minority and the majority leaders make the closing statements. And we tried very hard to persuade our colleagues when we spoke, the last two speakers for our respective positions, but we never once made it personal about the other. So I think part of it is how people conduct themselves. Two other factors I think that probably are even more important. The first is gerrymandering, and the second is money in politics. Elbridge Gerry signed the Declaration of Independence, so he is a Massachusetts politician at the very beginning of our country's history. And he began the practice of tinkering with congressional district lines following each census. As you know, the Constitution requires a census every 10 years, and it requires that the House districts be redrawn to ensure that each House member represents an approximately equal number of people, contrasted with the Senate, where the representation is by state. Gerrymandering has always occurred, but it was very light. County lines, municipal lines, ward lines in big cities. Technology is neutral. We all know the tremendous advances in our lives, changes in our lives by technology. The first iPhone came out 10 years ago. Think how the smartphone has changed the daily rhythm of your life and every human life in just the past few years. But technology can be used for evil purposes as well. It has enhanced and enabled terrorists to conduct activities that they could not have conducted 20, 30, or 60 years ago. There's always been terrorism, but never the technological means to advance it in the way that has occurred. And one way that technology has been used for not good purposes has been in the redrawing of congressional districts. In 2000, Democrats controlled a majority of the state legislatures, and they were excessively partisan in the way they drew the lines in an effort to manipulate it to their favor. 10 years later, 2010, Republicans controlled majority of legislatures, and the difference in technology was like 10 light years between what existed in 2000 and what existed in 2010. So they did it to a degree and with a precision that was 1,000 times more effective than were the Democrats in 2000. So you had numerous states in which Republican candidates for the House got between 45 and 50% of the vote and got 2/3 or 3/4 of the seats. And that's created this problem. In the House of Representatives in our country today, the general election is virtually meaningless. Of the 435 seats, fewer than 50 are competitive as between the parties. The rest are fixed for the parties until at least 2022, and the only question is what happens in those swing 50 seats or so seats that'll tip the margin. So the result is that the nominating process is more important than the general election, and we all know how pathetic our voter participation is, even in hotly contested presidential elections. And in the nominating process for the House, a tiny fraction of Americans take part, and they tend to be the most interested, most vigorous, rigid, ideological partisans. So you got 50 or so Tea Party House members. They are not concerned about what happens at the national level. Their only fear is that someone further to their right will get the nomination, and so they move further and further to the right. And increasingly, House members are being elected to the Senate, and rather than adapting to the mores of the Senate, they bring the mores of the House with them, with its much more intense partisanship. We have to change the way that redistricting occurs to drain the partisanship to the extent possible and permit the drawing of reasonable and reasonably compact and competitive congressional districts. I think that's absolutely important, and 16 states are moving in that direction. California and Iowa are the most advanced, but others are doing that. The second issue is money. American democracy has been corrupted by money. And I'll illustrate it by asking you a question I ask audiences all over this country for the past 10 years. As to our elected, the members of Congress generally, especially the House, how many of you believe they're more responsive to their constituents than they are to their donors? Yeah, well, there's an occasional hand goes up, but usually none. And the answer is, it's money. I've urged you to look at a lot of things. I really urge you to look at a 60-minute segment in April of 2016 when a Republican member of the House of Representatives, David Jolly, came on television and courageously described in great detail the orientation process that he had received when he first went to the House. And to be fair, the Democrats do exactly the same. And it was all about money. He was told how to allocate his time, and he showed on television a card which he'd been given. 4.5 hours every day fundraising, 1 hour for legislative issue, 1 hour to talk to your constituents. We're drowning in a swamp of corrupt money influence in politics. The Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court and related decisions. They didn't invent the problem. Money has always been a factor in politics, but they made it far worse. I believe that decision will go down in American history as one of the worst decisions ever made by any Supreme Court in history because it opened up the floodgates. And here's the sad part of it. Those who defend that decision and defend more money in politics argue that sunlight is a great disinfectant. If you just let the American people know who gave what to whom, then they'll do the right thing based on that information. But parallel with the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United have come a series of other actions that has virtually eliminated transparency. Billions and billions of dollars were spent in the campaign of 2016 that neither you nor any other Americans know who gave what to whom. So we now have the worst of both worlds. Billions of dollars pouring into the system and the decreasing and disappearing transparency about who's giving what to whom. It's the worst you can have. And until we change those two things, gerrymandering and money in politics, we're going to get more of the same. Thank you all very much. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Senator Mitchell. On behalf of the entire UNE community, I want to thank you so much for those most interesting remarks, and I also want to acknowledge President George and First Lady Barbara Bush and Peter and Roz Whelan for their generous support of this lecture series. So thank you all very much and good evening.